Hey folks, we're back with another Roguelite review. Specifically, I'll be talking shop about Leikir and Cyanide Studios' Roguelords, a devilishly difficult turn-based RPG where you guide legendary monsters against the forces of Van Helsing. That said, was this title too tantalizing a temptation to turn away, or a hellish experience to endure? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Long ago, the devil roamed the lands freely, a dark messiah for the creatures of the night, which saw the souls of humans twisted by terror, poisoned by promises of power. Only with the emergence of hunters did the tide shift. Led by Van Helsing, they drove the darkness back before finally succeeding in banishing the devil himself back to hell. And this was fine, for a time. Though he could no longer roam freely, corrupted souls still found their way to the depths. Until now. For unknown reasons, the steady stream of spirits has slowed, threatening to starve the Dark Lord. Still, he's bided his time well enough so that he might subtly spread his influence to the world once more, and perhaps unravel this great mystery, all while getting his vengeance upon Van Helsing and his ilk. So, yeah, you're playing the villains. Admittedly, it's not entirely a cut-and-dry black and white situation, given your enemies wind up being a fanatical order of oppressive religious extremists committed to doing anything to prevent your return. But, it might be justified, given the sheer amount of destruction you wreak over the course of the story. Speaking of which, the central narrative is split up into a number of distinct chapters, each of which is focused upon the retrieval of a specific artifact meant to help orchestrate the devil's return, and make things worse for the world at large. Execution-wise, this plays out in a handful of scenes interspersed throughout each of the missions, providing a nice reward as you overcome the various challenges. That said, while this certainly traces out the central conflict, I'd actually argue against this being the bulk of Roguelord's storytelling. Instead, I'd say that it's largely contained in the game's events. See, as you journey through the lands, you'll come across event tiles, which provide nifty benefits to the acolytes under your control. That said, these aren't just excuses to engage in hilariously diabolical dealings for the sake of being evil. Like, yeah, some of them are, but there's a fair number that provide a lot more context for the events of the game, such as the outbreak of the plague ravaging the land, the mysterious creatures beholden to the church, and the way that the institution enforces its will against the common populace. Frankly, I felt they contributed a lot to my understanding of Roguelord's world. And that was pretty nice, since I already had a lot on my plate as far as figuring things out went. See, Roguelords might look like a simple turn-based RPG at a glance, but I found myself both challenged and compelled by what this roguelite had to offer. Now fundamentally, your objective is straightforward enough. You take control of a small squad of the Devil's acolytes and rampage across the countryside in a series of missions, each of which culminate in a boss battle with one of Van Helsing's compatriots. That said, there is a lot to figure out here, with the foremost being combat. Now at a glance, this probably doesn't look overly complex, but I'll wholly admit that it took me a bit to adapt how Roguelords handles ability use and the overall action economy for its turns. See, rather than every character on your team getting an action, you're instead allocated a certain number of action points you can spend per turn, split between the entirety of your party. In and of itself, this makes the choice of figuring out who to use and when a tactical decision, and yet an additional layer is added due to the cooldown system. Specifically, once used, an ability is tapped and stays that way, even after turns pass. Instead, to regain access to the abilities, you need to use the character's respective refresh ability, which will replenish the entirety of their skill set all at once. That said, given that the refresh ability isn't exempt from the action point cost, it more or less enforces the need to make use of your character's kits as efficiently as possible in order to squeeze the most you can out of your action points. Especially during the early game, where the overall abilities available to each disciple are at their most limited. It's not uncommon for your turns to be dominated by the need to drop a specific enemy or mitigate their damage output somehow due to the surprising lethality of even some common encounters. And this is despite the fact that your disciples are healed to full at the start of every battle and have 2 different forms of health to hide behind. Admittedly, getting knocked down to 0 doesn't kill that character, but it does leave them in a vulnerable state where every ensuing chunk of damage is deducted from your Devil Essence, which serves as the vitality pool for your run, as well as a resource for another system I'll get into a bit later. It's for this reason that I was extremely grateful that enemies will highlight who they're going to attack and for how much, as well as whether it will lead to essence damage. Though, at the same time, it is not a perfect system. See, while you'll see a symbol when an enemy is intending on buffing or debuffing, you don't actually get an indicator of what exactly they're going to do. So if an enemy happens to do something that increases the outgoing damage of their allies or ramp up the damage you're taking, those predicted damage values might pale in comparison to the damage that winds up shredding into your essence pool. So, simply put, it's a lot, and it's why I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the characters themselves. While you initially start with 3, it's not that long before the game begins introducing the rest of the cast, either by dint of unlocking them through the act of playing, or after you clear certain chapters. And frankly, the addition of each one feels pretty big, given all of them have their own unique playstyles, which can lead to some pretty interesting synergies or absolutely show-stealing performances from an individual character once they gather a bit of steam. For instance, while Dracula is one of your starting characters, he's more than viable throughout your entire adventure, in part because his replenishability applies to the entirety of your team, which can lead to much more economic turns. And he's no slouch offensively, given he has a neat mechanic where some of his abilities play out twice while he's in a vulnerable state. Add in lifesteal abilities and evasion options, and he can play tanky or make use of abilities that cost health to optimize his damage output for a more risk-reward oriented playstyle. On my end, I was rather partial to Baron Samedi, given that he played around with the depression mechanic, a status which causes sanity damage and reduces the maximum sanity value of an enemy. Which is to say, even if an enemy decides to heal their sanity, it's not really gonna matter. Frankly, I was in love with his kit for a good chunk of the game, though I also achieved some truly heinous numbers with the Creature, who is one of the final characters you'll unlock in the game and has the unique distinction of obliging you to bring his other half, Dr. Frankenstein. Which, as you can imagine, has its own implications team building wise. Especially since their early game is sort of frustrating due to said character's initial action economy. Speaking of which, the way abilities handles in this game is a bit interesting. See, each character starts out with a trio of active abilities and their replenish. While there's a few ways to get more, the most common is snagging them from fights, though doing so means actively disregarding the other potential rewards. Early on, this can be a bit hit and miss for quite a few reasons. First off, per roguish rules, the options you're presented are entirely random, and you have no way of predicting if you'll even get abilities for a character you've been investing in the growth of. Secondly, you'll only have 5 slots per character to start with, which means you have to be fairly tactical with what you scoop up, or figuring out which ability you can most afford to overwrite. The last element, however, is skill rarity. See, by default, every skill you get is a common white skill, quite a number of which are just outright mediocre. That said, there's 2 rarities above that, each of which introduce unique abilities, many of which can prove to be central to a character's strategy. Now, there's a couple ways to get these. The easiest is through the shop or through certain events, but the one you'll most often rely upon is ability fusion. Specifically, whenever you collect 3 copies of an ability, they fuse together to form a higher tier version. While this is pretty useful in and of itself, including moments where an ability becomes cheaper to play, it's made even better because it then allows you to pick a new ability from the pool to help populate your now empty ability slots at the same rarity as the skill you just acquired. I mean, yes, it can get pretty tricky to get 3 copies of a given card with the space allotted to you, but this is where another quirk of Roguelords kicks in, specifically with the sacrifice tiles. See, along your journey, you'll encounter tiles which require you to sacrifice an ability from one of your characters. Doing so prevents further copies of that ability from appearing during the course of your run, but in exchange, you get a new ability of the same rarity as the sacrificed one, as well as an extra ability slot for that acolyte. While you can only gain an extra pair of slots per character, you can pare down the sort of cards you encounter in a run substantially, though it's entirely valid to just nerf one character if you happen to be sitting on a pile of abilities that you can't bear to part with. And yet, even this, all of what I just said doesn't encompass everything because I haven't talked terror yet. See, at certain checkpoints throughout a run, as a reward from certain events, as well as a potential reward from every fight, you can ramp up the world's terror value. On its own, it's a fascinating enough mechanic, as terror causes a unique effect to crop up on every tile of a certain row after the one you just cleared. Essentially, a delayed reward. And these can be fairly potent, like gaining more maximum essence or currency to spend at a shop, or even modifiers to your fights, like getting more souls or twice as many skills from an encounter. That said, another key element, and one which always led to me ramping terror as quickly as possible in a run, is the fact that your current terror level dictates the base rarity of any skill you encounter. Once your terror level increases, you'll start to find tier 2 abilities as part of your rewards, and once it's high enough, every ability will be tier 2 by default, which helps considerably. It also just provides you a free relic with every new proper terror level acquired, which can wind up feeling pretty significant, especially if you pick up one of your Acolyte's signature relics. But yeah, at this juncture, this has effectively addressed the basics of the game's combat, and yet that's not the core idea at Roguelord's heart, the devil in its details. Because again, this game is hard, and sometimes the encounters you'll be tossed into can feel brutally unfair, which is why it provides you the means to cheat. Remember that devil essence I mentioned that serves as your health pool for your actual run? Well, it also serves as fuel for your ability to subvert the system of the game, to do things like heal your minions, to bottom out an enemy's health and force them into a state of vulnerability, to swap status effects between characters, like stealing an enemy's buff or throwing a debuff they inflicted on you onto them, or even take an ability off cooldown without using your replenish skill. Simply put, it's a fascinating system which provides you with an incredibly powerful set of options to turn the tide of battle, albeit at the cost of making yourself more vulnerable to an enemy if your strategy falls apart. And while there are tiles that can replenish your essence, without a terror effect to amplify it, it tends to be in moderation, which often makes the choice of whether or not to use it feel significant. Especially since you can also use your essence out of combat to do things like teleport to a tile on the map that's more beneficial to you, or up your chances at succeeding events. It just encompasses so much. Which, right, that's yet another layer to the whole team building conundrum, if only because of how heavily it overlaps with the trait system. See, while I've talked at great length about the characters and their kits, what I haven't mentioned is their social traits. See, when you encounter an event, you're often given the opportunity to take a stat check, which measures how frightening, stealthy, or even tempting an acolyte may be insofar as their attempts at making the lives of mortals miserable. What's important about this, however, is not the fact that it helps you succeed in the event, but rather that doing so allows your characters to banter amongst each other. The reason this is important is because banter serves as a means for you to gain personality traits, though you can also gain them from terror tiles and just events on their own. Here's the thing though, personality traits aren't just relegated to increasing your chances at succeeding events, since they also include things like boosting your max health and sanity, or even just boosting your damage. Admittedly, there's negative traits as well, and banter checks can be negative even if you succeed a check, but the odds are generally more positive as long as you succeed the check, and there's actually nothing preventing a back and forth banter just loading up your characters with multiple traits if you're lucky. Suffice to say, it makes taking the stat checks during the events extremely tempted versus the guaranteed outcomes, especially if you have the essence to spare to make them a sure success. Here's the thing though, while all these systems can certainly come together to make for some absolutely busted character potential, it's still not going to be an easy trek, and a large part of that I found was the way that difficulty is treated on the whole. See, while Rogue Lords tasks the player with clearing 7 chapters to advance the story, the overall difficulty isn't necessarily tied to each of those different chapters. In fact, beyond the main bosses, the enemies you'll encounter in each one are largely the same, though to its credit, there is a fairly decent roster to tear through. Instead, whenever you clear a chapter and advance the story, the overarching difficulty of the entire game ramps up. Which is to say, even if you decide to poke back to an earlier chapter for a victory lap or to have a rematch against an earlier boss, the difficulty is now locked at whatever juncture you've reached. Enemies become tankier, hit harder, they begin to ambush you between areas, and there's also more negative events which crop up across the map, potentially influencing the paths you take, given it'll plunk things down, like losing max devil essence if you land on a certain tile, acquiring negative character traits, or just amplifying how much devil essence you spend when you try and cheat. It gets rough. Admittedly, if you're overwhelmed by all this or feeling restricted, the game does offer a difficulty modifier that allows you to start with more essence by default and slightly tones down the fights, which can help make things a bit easier, especially in later chapters, but even with that, you will need to get good. In fact, I found quite a few of my runs stymied because I wound up picking a fight with an elite enemy and simply wasn't in a position to deal with their mechanics, since a number of them have nasty scaling potential, or the ability to wage a battle of attrition that I had no hope of winning. And that's without even factoring in the chapter bosses who they honestly deserve the title. While there's certainly a number of enemies who will have certain mechanics you'll need to look out for as you progress the game, including some of the nastiness of the elite fights like I just mentioned, they all pale compared to the bosses, since they tend to be a bit more mechanically involved than their peers, and highly lethal. In fact, if you're not ready for a mechanic, it's entirely possible, and even probable, that certain bosses will just outright brick a run, especially for the latter ones. Such as Gloria. She is probably the most intricate fight in the entire game, and absolutely capable of punishing you if you don't take her seriously, since her whole strategy is essentially locking down what actions your team can take, and just outright nuking the offending character if they fail to adhere to it. And their final phase makes everything worse. While she's perhaps the most egregious example, all of them are more than capable of just casually ending you if you do not take this encounter serious and do not prepare for it. If anything inspired me to master the art of cheating the system and for making my characters as busted as possible, it was them. Though I'll admit that a few of my antics were also inspired by the game's achievement system, since earning achievements also unlocks new relics and abilities for you to encounter and generally just sort of changes up what you can do during your playthrough. But yeah, that's largely my experience with the gameplay, so let's talk shop about graphics, specifically just how lovely the world design is. Honestly, while it's mostly window dressing, it is fun to be able to wander around the world map and just soak in that bleak atmosphere. I do not doubt for one second that a heap of love was put into the character design at large either. Whether it's the acolytes or your enemies, everyone looks great, and I found myself pleased as punch to see that the various abilities had their own distinct animations. Also, Lilith's design is fantastic, and my girlfriend is very appreciative of her. And on the whole note of fantastic, so is the sound design for that matter. The soundtrack, for instance, is a delightfully cinematic ensemble of gothic music. While some pieces are strictly instrumental, others weave in gorgeous choruses of ghostly vocals. All of them, however, contribute to the overall drama of the journey, weaving awe and trepidation together skillfully. It's just really, really good as far as scene setting goes. And the game's no slouch when it comes to voice acting either, though the real show stealer there is the devil by any and all accounts.
This town is repulsive. I'd love to watch it burn.
But yeah, that's Rogue Lords. It's a game I've had on my backlog for quite some time, and I finally got around to it this year. And really, the only thing I can say is that I regret not getting to it earlier. It provides a legitimately unique roguelike experience with a combat system I've never really encountered before. Yes, my initial experience was a bit rough, since the learning curve felt a bit steep at times, and yet I found myself enticed by how much freedom it actually provided me. There were so many different ways to solve combat encounters and to progress through each mission. Figuring out how to work around the limitations and make my team shine in absolutely gonzo ways was a treat, especially when it came to testing those builds against the bosses. And my climatic final run at the tail end of my 29 hours for the game, it honestly felt like the perfect finish for my experience. That, and while I did unlock Infernal mode, well, being tossed into a random chapter, albeit with somewhat beefed up enemies, wasn't really enough to keep me playing. The stories are good fun though, and I did find myself legitimately invested in the world building it established through the events. That and just taking a fair bit of amusement out of the mischief you can get into. Really, there was only 2 issues I ran into. One was a minor visual bug where you'd load into a game and it would show you having as no achievements or account progress, but it doesn't actually affect you. Once you get into a run, you'll be able to see everything you do have unlocked. It's strictly a visual thing. The other actually sucks, since the game locked up at a path selection, and this persisted even when I reset the game and tried to use a portal to bypass it. That said, this only happened to me once over the course of all my runs, so I'm not super bothered. Basically, what I'm trying to say here is, ultimately, I can highly recommend this game as a hit. Frankly, if you're a fan of strategic roguelites, it would actually be a shame to pass this experience over. Also, if you're worried about being able to invest time, because real life work, etc., this game is extremely forgiving about saving after every encounter, so you can easily pick up where you were whenever you want. So, yeah. Anyways, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Shrimpmania, Greenwich Babby, and Andy Noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.